Thank you for the introduction, Suzanne, and for hosting this important forum. The Chamber of Commerce has been a leader in responding to the pandemic and promoting global recovery. I look forward to continuing to work with you and the private sector to realize the Biden administration's vision for a better American economy. Anyone observing the United States in recent years would see striking contrasts across our economic landscape. We've been the largest economy in the world for over a century, and our national income has risen steadily. Yet in recent decades, a rising share of that income has gone to profits and disproportionate wage gains at the top, while middle class families have faced wage stagnation. We're a global leader in innovation and home to the world's top universities. We recently flew a helicopter on Mars. Yet visitors from abroad might be excused for concluding that their airports, trains, and highways are more modern and better maintained. We have world-class capital markets, financial institutions, angel investors who can muster funding for the most novel and ambitious projects. Yet many families are not able to finance a home, save for their children's education, or save adequately for their retirement. So it's understandable that many Americans feel left behind. More and more are expressing their discontent, and they're right to do so. Our country has experienced discontent before, notably in the late 1800s, when huge disparities emerged across the economy in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. The short-lived Populist Party, in its first political platform, proclaimed, "The people are demoralized. The fruits of the toil of millions are badly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for a few, unprecedented in the history of mankind." Fortunately, what followed that wave of populism was a progressive movement led by people willing to think big and act big to address long-standing flaws in our system. They created a new, more equitable and stable order. In the years just before and after World War I, they introduced a progressive income tax, strengthened anti-monopoly laws, created the Federal Reserve, and provided women the right to vote. Then, amidst the Great Depression, the New Deal created Social Security, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the Fair Labor Standards Act. That legislation, some of it controversial in its time, continues to provide opportunity and assurance and stability that Americans count on every day. The question today is whether we too can think big and act big. The American people are already doing this with their innovative spirit, their tireless efforts to not just make ends meet, but to improve the lives of their family. Today, I will talk about how the Biden administration is setting out to do our part to tackle unaddressed problems that have built up over several decades, improving our economy in ways that will benefit our children and grandchildren. Americans are known for optimism and the ability to achieve what we set our minds to. I have full confidence that we are up to the task. Our first problem from day one was COVID-19. We have experienced a tragic loss of lives over the last year, and also the loss of jobs and livelihoods. By nearly every measure, health, income, wealth, or job loss, lower income populations have been hardest hit, with women and people of color facing the worst outcomes. So our immediate priority was to end the pandemic and address its economic ravages. Securing the production and distribution of vaccines in the United States has been a monumental and successful effort. Beyond vaccines, our goal was to pass the American Rescue Plan to help Americans reach the end of the pandemic with their family finances intact. Because of this support, Our country is now unlikely to suffer the kind of long-lasting impairment that we saw after the global financial crisis, when foreclosures and bankruptcies weighed upon the economy for years. The IMF projects that this legislation will allow our economy to regain its pre-pandemic size this year and even regain its pre-pandemic path by next year. We're ahead of other advanced economies in this regard. At the same time, ending the pandemic gives us the opportunity to shape our recovery and tackle our most pressing socioeconomic challenges. And that brings me to the second problem, our long-standing underinvestment in public infrastructure and institutions that drive productivity and support workers and families. To address this, I believe we must reorient our framing of US fiscal policy. For decades, the prevailing focus has been on the need to decrease and then limit the size of government as a share of the economy. Within that framing, there has been broad bipartisan support for ensuring that defense expenditures respond to US security needs, and for protecting entitlement spending, which has increased with rising healthcare costs and population aging. Discretionary spending has been compressed as a consequence. Now, exceptions have been made, most often in the form of temporary support for the economy following shocks and in times of recession, both through spending increases and tax cuts. But ambitious and valuable initiatives like the Affordable Care Act engendered enough controversy to foreclose at that time the possibility of broadening the agenda. This approach to US fiscal policy, founded on a distrust of government motives and effectiveness, along with resistance to higher taxes, has had profound effects on our nation and our people. We haven't maintained our infrastructure, let alone modernized it. We haven't sufficiently supported public research and development to ensure that America will maintain its technological edge. We haven't embraced the investments in education and training that we need to keep up with technological change and to compete in the international marketplace as we once did. And we haven't built support systems for families to improve child health, education, and well-being, and provide adequate child care. That's why the president proposed the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. These policies will promote a dynamic economy with greater opportunity for workers, higher living standards, and over time, reduced inequality. Public investments not only create good jobs, they also increase the value of our existing resources. The Jobs Plan proposes a range of productivity and profitability boosting public investments, totaling $2.2 trillion over the coming 10 years, about 0.75% of GDP. That's a large number, but an achievable one. The Jobs Plan will build and modernize physical infrastructure like bridges and roads, but there will also be investments in an infrastructure for the future: broadband, research and development, public transportation, modernized schools, and a more expansive network of childcare providers. We know that, like any private sector investment, the payoff to any one infrastructure project is uncertain. But what we propose is a portfolio of public investments that together will have a significant positive payoff directly to the American people, to workers and entrepreneurs, whether in convenience, connectivity, educational opportunity, productivity, or business efficiency. Alongside the Jobs Plan, we are proposing to fundamentally reform the corporate tax system. That will help offset the cost of the proposed public investments. With corporate taxes at an historical low of 1% of GDP, we believe the corporate sector can contribute to this effort by bearing its fair share. We propose simply to return the corporate tax toward historical norms. At the same time, we want to eliminate incentives that reward corporations for moving their operations overseas and shifting profits to low-tax countries. As part of this effort, we're working with our international partners on a global minimum corporate tax to stop the race to the bottom. We're confident that the investments and tax proposals in the jobs plan, taken as a package, will enhance the net profitability of our corporations and improve their global competitiveness. And we hope business leaders will see it this way and support the jobs plan. The third problem is that we've failed to meet the looming threat of climate change, and we risk falling behind in the race for new low-carbon technologies. We know that climate change poses an existential threat, but we also know it presents an historic economic opportunity for those companies, industries, and countries that seize the mantle of leadership and drive the transition to a global low-carbon economy. Unfortunately, in recent years, the federal government largely ignored the problem while ceding economic leadership to other countries. For example, solar and wind are already the fastest growing segments of the global energy market. But China's taken the lead in both and is racing ahead in developing battery storage technologies as well. Our disadvantage deepened over the last 4 years with our exit from the Paris Agreement, the removal of dozens of important environmental protections, and our underinvestment in technologies of the future. We're now less prepared than we ought to be for the increasingly frequent and deadly impacts of climate-related weather events, and less equipped to lead the global economic transformation underway. This administration is acting and will make up for lost time. The American Jobs Plan responds to the climate change challenge by investing in new energy infrastructure and supporting research and development that will incentivize innovation in renewable energy technologies. We also need to protect our energy infrastructure against malicious cyber threats. The transition to a greener economy will provide a multi-decade boost to the economy, creating jobs along the way as the private sector participates in the development of new technologies, new investments, and the new products that will drive the global economic transformation. And finally, the fourth problem is the absence of attention to the long-standing impediments and inequities that limit opportunities for social mobility and make everyday life more challenging for many Americans. Workers, particularly lower wage earners, have seen wage growth stagnate over several decades, despite overall rising productivity and national income. There are several contributors to this troubling trend, but one important factor is an erosion in labor's bargaining power. This partly reflects a decline in unionization and the real minimum wage, along with a marked increase in outsourcing, both domestically and globally. Moreover, a large share of the growth in labor income that has occurred is accrued to the top 10% of workers in the wage distribution. These trends have resulted in growing inequality and divergence in wealth, a preservation of the racial wealth gap and a hollowing out of the middle class. Combined with rising costs for childcare and health care, increased work stress, and riskier retirements without pensions, we've seen a widening in gaps in measures of well-being, such as life expectancies, deaths from suicide and drug overdoses, and social isolation. The Biden administration has crafted the American Families Plan to address the troubling trend of rising inequality by providing a strong foundation for opportunity and inclusion. The Families Plan proposes major investments in education, childcare, and the care economy. As recent research shows, investments in early childhood education is one of the highest paying long-term investments we can make. Over time, it will produce payoffs that far exceed the initial costs. The Families Plan also aims to provide people the support they need to be effective employees while fulfilling their responsibilities at home. Investment in early childhood care can be an important determinant of labor force participation, one of the key drivers of economic growth. Paid leave, similarly, can support increased labor force participation. Expanding these programs is a critical step in reversing the ongoing divergence in labor force participation rates in our country versus other developed countries. In addition, a versatile education system that's closely tied to local labor markets should be a cornerstone of any 21st century public investment program. And that begins with our commitment to making community college free for every American. The plan also contains a series of meaningful expansions in the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, and the Child Independent Care Tax Credit that will collectively provide greater economic security to workers and families who have too often not felt the benefits of economic growth in decades past. All told, the Families Plan will transform our fight against childhood poverty and provide unprecedented support to low-income and middle-class families. The American Families Plan will be paid for by a series of tax reforms that ensure that wealthy individuals are paying their fair share, and we seek to address the rise in tax evasion, which has stacked the deck for decades against responsible and compliant taxpayers. The initiatives I just outlined are necessary to reshape the American economy, maintain our strong contribution to the global economy, and continue American leadership in the future. Of course, our well-being is inextricably linked to the fortunes of the rest of the world, for better or worse. A prosperous and stable global economy will bolster U.S. economic growth and job creation, as consumers around the world will want to buy American goods made by American workers. Treasury is working closely with our international partners as we continue to fight the pandemic and ensure strong global growth, mitigate the worst effects on the world's poorest countries, and tackle generational global issues like climate change. Yet there's a growing risk of fragmentation of the global economy, evidenced by market-driven regionalization and the rise of regional global value chains. America needs to have a strong presence in global markets. We will fight for a level playing field for trade and investment, and we will confront adversaries who take advantage by ignoring or abusing rules and norms of behavior. At the same time, we should embrace competition abroad as we embrace it at home. Let others innovate and advance. Let us seek to advance faster and further. We ultimately benefit from the positive spillovers of innovation wherever it occurs. As in any competition, if you lose one contest, you work harder to win the next. The better the competition, the stronger you will get. That has been the American way. To conclude, it's time to recommit our government to playing a more active and smarter role in the economy. The administration's planned actions are not fiscal stimulus in the way we've seen in the past, nor are they intended to target a particular size of government. Rather, we're proposing smart investments to make our economy more competitive and sustainable, to provide opportunities for all families and workers, and to make our tax system fairer. So let us think big. Let us redouble our efforts to create opportunity, social mobility, and ultimately widespread and sustainable prosperity now and for our children's children. In the hit musical, as Alexander Hamilton approached death, he ponders the question, what is a legacy? He answers, it's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. Well, Let's build back better together and build something that lasts for generations. We Americans deserve a better deal. Thank you.
It's always an honor to hear from the Treasury Secretary, including and maybe even especially when we disagree, as we do on taxes. The data and the evidence are clear. The proposed tax increases would greatly disadvantage U.S. businesses and harm American workers. And now is certainly not the time to erect new barriers to economic recovery. The administration is right to champion infrastructure, and we want to be there with them to do that, but there are other ways to finance it. Our recovery, of course, also depends on how well we tackle the pandemic itself. For more on this, we turn to a discussion on pandemic crisis management.
Good morning. My name is Michael Carney. I'm the Senior Vice President of Emerging Issues at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. We have been working to defeat COVID-19 since early 2020. That work continues today in the United States and around the world through the Global Task Force on Pandemic Response. I'm honored today to welcome two distinguished guests who represent the broad collaboration that's allowed us to make so much progress against this deadly disease. You may know Andy Slavitt from his appearances at the regular COVID-19 briefings from the White House. He is a veteran of business and public service who is now helping lead the United States response to the pandemic. From the private sector, we have Dave Clark, the CEO of Amazon's worldwide consumer business. Dedicated Amazonians have kept us fed and supplied, even in the darkest days of the pandemic. Amazon was an early leader in workplace COVID-19 testing and is now hosting vaccination clinics for employees and communities, an important contribution to our collective efforts to vaccinate America. Thanks to both of you for taking the time to join us for today's discussion about how the United States has gotten back on track. We're clearly not out of the woods. COVID anywhere is COVID everywhere, but conditions have improved in recent months. This is thanks to the continued vigilance of the American people and the unprecedented partnership between government and industry that enabled us to do things like bring new vaccines and therapeutics to market. So Andy, thanks for joining us. I'll throw the first question to you. How confident are you in the recovery? And is the worst behind us, or is the White House concerned about future surges like we saw in the winter?
Well, thanks very much for having me and having us on, and it's great to be with Dave. Look forward to this. Credit to our scientists and years of research. Now, everything's not solved. You know, there are, as we all know, a set of challenges ahead of us. There's a set of Americans who are still considering whether they want to get vaccinated, and much of our recovery will depend on how they decide. But importantly, I think we need to respect people's processes, respect the fact that people who haven't gotten vaccinated yet, many of them have questions that they need answers to. Many of them want to see what happened with the vaccinations that went before them. So if you've been vaccinated, talk to people, tell them what the experience was like, have them talk to their doctors, have them talk to their pharmacists, help them understand why it's important, but respect the fact that people need to make their own decisions. We also have to make vaccinations easier. And then I think, as I'm sure we will talk about, our job is not done even if we end up being successful in the US. Many of you have friends, colleagues, families, and operations across the world, and understand what a fortunate position the US is in to have these vaccines available to us at a time when people around the world are going through really difficult challenges. And the US has got to take its leadership role seriously and step up and help with that too.
So Dave, it's hard to believe that it's only been a year or a little bit more than a year since the pandemic began. But back then, as we went into lockdown, your company became a critical service for much of the country. How did you react to the giant disruptions in supply chains, but also find ways to keep employees safe?
Well, first, let me say I'm really happy to be here with you and Andy today, and I'm really grateful for the leadership of the Biden administration over the last few months and setting some audacious goals for getting the country vaccinated and the progress we're on there. As Andy said, there's some real light at the end of the tunnel there that I'm excited about. I really want to thank Michael, you and Suzanne and the whole team, as well at the U.S. Chamber, who have also done a fantastic job over the last year supporting business in the U.S. and helping sort of around the world, companies and people deal with the pandemic and the challenges that everybody's faced for the last year. You're right to talk about the supply chain disruption. I mean, it really, we've never seen anything like it. I can't think of anything in my sort of professional life that's disrupted as broadly as this did, from everything from the customer front to where and how people can leave their home and where they can shop, all the way back to the manufacturing source points, whether that be in the US or anywhere around the world. I think we all learned just how interconnected we are as a society and a global society, and what happens in one country and in one part of the world, how it impacts all the rest of us. And we've been, I think, as businesses around the world and Amazon have been dealing with that and working to get supply chain disruption repaired and back in place for consumers over the last year, and continue to work through that. And I think will for some time. Our initial challenge was we were faced with unprecedented demand. All of a sudden you have this mix of customers who can't leave their home, and everybody needs things delivered and wants things delivered so they can stay safe. And we're trying to balance that with how do we also keep our own workforce safe. We have the second largest workforce in the U.S., over 800,000 people, and most of those folks need to come to work every day to do their jobs. And we had to pivot quickly to how do we change hundreds of processes and put social distancing into our facilities, and trying to source daily masks and PPE for almost 1 million people to operate every day. And so every aspect of our company pivoted to be able to address those. You mentioned it, but maybe one of the most important pieces of that was actually testing and building out. We had great partnership with government agencies to help support that and build out our own internal testing labs, which have now tested millions of employees in the U.S. and abroad, to help help us spot where we were having challenges and help catch things early, given how many asymptomatic cases there actually were, and to prevent the spread in our workplaces. And we're now pivoting, as we see this great work in vaccines, we're pivoting that work into on-site vaccination clinics and vaccination processes for our local communities and our employees. And we're excited about that and what that means for our workforce and for our communities as we go forward. So.
Just a quick follow-up on vaccines, because that's definitely the path back to public health. When we think about work sites, is there anything else that we should be doing to ensure that essential workers have access to vaccines, both here and abroad? It's come up, with a number of companies that they're very eager to ensure that their employees have access to these safe and effective vaccines.
Well, we've been in this place of, so many of our employees have been coming to work for the fullness of the pandemic, and you have this, there's a lot of folks who have been ready and willing and supercharged to go out and get the vaccine. But there's another population that is looking at it like, well, I've been coming to work. There's some hesitancy there. And when we talk to people, we saw that. And that's why we moved to get on site. We did these public-private partnerships and partnerships with other entities to help us come on site to vaccinate our teams. We do on site now at over 250 locations around the U.S. And we see substantive increases, double-digit 20+% increases in the amount of people who immediately start to go get vaccinated when we can just simply remove the friction relative to having to leave, having to go to another location to do it. We also see that people adding some incentive helped. We put in an $80 payment to people who get vaccinated, $40 for each round of the shot, or $80 sort of total, plus some unpaid time off to people, trying to give people opportunity to, if they were worried about, how they might feel with the vaccine, give them flexibility to manage it. And we found that was very well received. And then I think the guidance we just got from the CDC is big. This ability to be able to be, if you've been vaccinated, to not wear a mask indoors and how safe you are as a vaccinated individual, I think is going to go a long way to helping reduce hesitancy.
Not surprisingly, Dave's hit on a lot of the right and successful points. Here's what we know from data that just, I think, supports a lot of what Dave just said. First of all, the number one thing that employees say is getting in the way for them to getting a vaccine is paid time off. So, and you might say, well, gosh, that's easier for larger employers to do, but at a small employer, it's hard. And it is harder because you rely on each person. But the federal government has put forward, as the chamber knows, and as many of you know, a tax credit for giving paid time off to people when they go get their vaccination, and if they feel like they're going to feel a little bit under the weather afterwards. We don't want anybody to feel like they're going to lose an hour of pay, and a lot of people are worried about that. I think particularly in the Hispanic Latinx population, if you have Hispanic employees, communicating with them, letting them know they're eligible, giving them the time off, letting them know that there are resources in Spanish. Number two, I'd say is I think it's a good thing to talk about at the workplace. It's a good thing because people don't. Here's a shocker for everybody. People don't necessarily want to hear from the government about a topic like this. They may or may not trust what they hear from the government or even the CDC. People do trust the people they know, and they trust the people they respect locally. They trust their colleagues and coworkers. They trust the medical officer if there's one in their company. They trust the local hospital, their doctors, their physicians. Encourage people to talk to people they know and to talk to people who've been vaccinated, because this is just people doing their homework. Let's not think of them as reluctant. Let's not even put a label on them. Let's just say that their decision-making process is such that they want to know some things before they make this decision. And so make that okay. Provide them that information. And I think more people will make the right choice because they're very effective and safe vaccines. And then removing every obstacle possible. We now have most places you go have walk-in appointments. So it's much, much easier. And people remember these horror stories from January and February where you had to get through like 7 websites and other things. It's not that way any longer. And let them know that.
So Andy, let's build on what you just were talking about, because that tracks with everything that we know. One of the other things that we've seen in recent research is you can help overcome any hesitancy in the workforce by making it as convenient as possible for people to get the shot. So this week, I think the White House announced that jurisdictions are going to get 28 million doses. 2/3 of them are going to go to the states. We know that, again, from research, that worksite vaccine clinics can increase willingness to get the shot. Do you think that we'll ever reach a point at which the federal government will help allocate doses to large employers, or that we'll see increased emphasis on worksite vaccine clinics? Or do you expect all of that to remain with states and localities?
So my answer is yes and yes. In that, number one, we do think that both on-site and near-site clinics are effective for exactly the reason you just said. We also think, as we studied this, we asked ourselves the question: who's most efficient at doing those? Is it the federal government or the state government? And we determined that by and large, it's the states are going to be much better at it because they know their employer size and sites. That there aren't that many. If the country was filled with only multi-site, multi-state employers like Amazon, it would be one thing. But for most people are within a single state. Most states have an abundance of vaccines. So I think if you got a hold of the public health officer, the vaccination effort in those states, whether you're in multiple states or whether you're just in one state, I think that's going to be successful. And the work we did suggested that states are actually doing a lot of on-site and near-site. Now, I have one more suggestion for you, in that I've talked with both CVS and Walmart and Walgreens and others, and many of them will provide a partnership. They will either come on site, they'll create special hours, they'll come nearby, they'll bring a car or van. So if you feel like, gosh, if we had near site or on site, we could do more vaccinations. My suggestion is to connect to one of the big pharmacies nearby, and they can correct me if they disagree. But I think many of them will be happy to figure out how to make it more convenient for your employees.
Yeah, I just reiterate that. I would reiterate, we've seen the same thing. States incredibly cooperative in participating with on-site events, and we've partnered with a number of different organizations and pharmacies to help us do those on-site vaccines, and it's worked fantastic. So I encourage other companies to do the same.
So shifting gears for a minute away from vaccines to testing, it's something that we struggled with early on in the pandemic. At first, we didn't have enough capacity and we weren't testing a broad enough group of people. Now we have robust testing capacity. I mean, I saw one estimate that it's somewhere around 500 million a month, maybe. But fewer people are electing to get tested. So Amazon was a leader in worksite testing. Are there lessons that you learned through that process that we can use either in a governmental way or other companies can learn from as we look at the next stages of the pandemic? And do you see testing as something that your company is going to continue with, even though vaccines are widely available?
Yeah, it's a great question. We did testing in particular in the early days, and I would say not even early, all the way up till now has been an integral part of our overall safety protocols and creating a very easy, efficient way for people to do testing on site. I think, one of the big takeaways I would think if I were writing an after action on what to do, what we learned from this pandemic, one of the things that I would take is, how do we spin up testing industry and broad testing capabilities in one of these kind of events faster? Because we found it so important to our processes that I can't imagine sort of having done the last 9 months without it. It's so important to be able to catch, particularly asymptomatic cases in individuals early in the process before they have a chance. It's where you get a chance to catch it before it spreads. It's putting the fire out before it really starts. And that has been incredibly important. I think as far as how do we go from here with testing, we continue to test and we expect we will for the foreseeable future. Again, as Andy said, people will, the majority of people I think are going to, get vaccinated, and while others continue to investigate and understand their personal approach to vaccination, testing provides an opportunity to continue to see what's happening with COVID in our workplace in the months ahead. I think you'll see that the testing quantity reduce because, as the vaccinated population grows, fewer and fewer people who are vaccinated will feel the need, or have the need to be tested. And more of the testing will focus in on people who have chosen for whatever personal reason not to be vaccinated at this point.
So Andy, when you think about testing, what kind of messages do you want people to walk away with? Do we want people to still aggressively make use of public testing facilities now that vaccines are everywhere? Like, what's the current thinking from the administration about testing?
Well, look, one thing that encourages me is the coming availability of low-cost, take-home, and point-of-care tests. Because I think people with a little bit more information, having a stronger sense of whether or not they're infectious or not is the kind of information people are looking for. And so there's going to be an ongoing need. Remember, kids under 12 aren't yet able to be tested. People with cancer aren't able to be tested yet. We don't know how long these vaccines work for. So, we shouldn't be moving to say, hey, let's flip the switch off and forget the pandemic ever happened. We're still going through this. A lot of people are at risk. We still have hundreds of people a day dying, which is horrifying. That we're even comforted that it's lower, but still, it's quite high by any other standard. So, knowing whether you're infectious, which I think is what the use case is. I'm going to go into the workplace. I'm going to go to church. I'm going to go to a ball game. Do I want to know if I'm infectious? That's going to be something that, because unlike the flu, right, your body tells you you're infectious when you have the flu. With COVID, your body doesn't always tell you you're infectious before you know it plenty of times. So that's why it's useful. I think there's two other kinds of testing that will remain important. One is surveillance testing that states and local governments are going to have to continue to do, and we'll do that in more and more clever ways, wastewater and other non-invasive things to say, hey, you know what, this community is got growing risk. That'll be important. And then, of course, there'll be the traditional testing that you'll get, what people now know as the PCR testing, although I bet no one on the phone, including me, can quite say what PCR stands for. But so we will have those needs. I think they will become baked in part of the infrastructure. And Dave's exactly right. We had to turn a bespoke industry into a scale industry in the middle of a pandemic. Let's not do that again. Let's get there beforehand.
I don't think we would disagree with that. So Dave, now that we're moving closer toward a post-pandemic America, fingers crossed, what are some of the challenges that a company like Amazon faces when we think about whatever normal looks like? And is there anything that the Biden administration or other governments can be doing to support the recovery of the economy?
Yeah, when we started talking about how much disruption and how much change and how challenging it was at the beginning to get set up and to get in a place to keep our people safe for the pandemic. And I thought that was pretty hard and challenging. And I think maybe unwinding may be as challenging or more challenging. Just we've spent so much time ingraining these behavioral things like masks and social distancing, and we've been in this very intense situation for a long time that getting people, moving people out of this back into normalcy is going to be challenging, and particularly in a mix where you have an increasing population of people who are vaccinated, but a group who has not been vaccinated yet. I'm very encouraged that, one, I'm excited about the goals the Biden administration has set. I think this goal of 70% by July 4th is a big deal, and a big deal for the country, and something we should all be running towards and figuring out how we help support and accomplish. And I think the announcement recently by the CDC that enables people to get who have been vaccinated, it says that you can basically remove your mask indoors and out and be in a relative safe position. I think that's a big announcement, a big change. When I talk to folks in our workforce, I hear a lot of comments like, well, why bother to get, they haven't been working from home for a year. They've been coming to work. And, if I have to keep wearing a mask, if I have to keep social distancing, why do I need to go get the vaccine right now? Why bother? And I think this, following the science and getting the announcements out and continuing to move forward with the safety of the vaccine and this miracle that these companies have created for us with these vaccines, I'm grateful to the companies who have done this and the governments and individuals who distribute it. The path that they've given us forward here is truly a miracle, and it's kind of brilliant. But people needed to see and hear that it was actually a path forward. There was concern, and as Andy said, people researching and trying to figure out what their life was going to be like post-vaccine. And I think as that picture becomes clearer, you're going to see more and more people, I hope, shift and go take the vaccine. And the announcements from the CDC are a good example of that. We communicated that message out to all 800,000 plus of our employees on the afternoon of the announcement, because we wanted people to hear it, we wanted people to know it, we wanted people to use that as a lever to start really pushing to get more appointments faster for vaccines so we can hit the goals that we all have. And so I think we're going to quickly work in our work environment to figure out how we enable our teams to take advantage of the new freedoms and the return to sort of normalcy of being vaccinated. And how do we do that? And how do we enable the people who have, for whatever personal reason, taken the personal responsibility on themselves to not get vaccinated, but they're going to manage their own situation in some other way? How do we enable them and the vaccinated population to work together is going to be a challenge that I'm hopeful we see some coordinated sort of communication guidance and work from all the various governmental organizations at the state and federal level.
So a question for both of you, as we think toward the future and we're optimistic, what should the role of industry be as we try and build back better?
Well, I'll start. Look, I think, let me just start with this on a personal level. January 20th, I got here in the White House. Almost from the day one, people all across the country called and said one thing: how can I help? Dave and Amazon were among those, the chamber itself, many businesses. And I wish Americans could have heard that call, because I just got this real sense that people are like, hey, we are all in this together. Let us know what we can do. And almost every time I talked to somebody, the answer was yes. Hey, we could use help here. We need help thinking about this. Yes, yes. People shared their ideas and their opinions, of course. That's helpful too. But it's very clear that this recovery belongs to the American public. This recovery belongs to the businesses, the other institutions in our country. It doesn't work unless everybody works through this together, and I think the same will be true for the recovery. We have to acknowledge that among the things lost were not only people's lives, but businesses that people had put their entire family into for decades that may have been lost overnight. And those are real losses. So I think this spirit of building back better means supporting people, individuals and businesses, as they get their legs under them. It means, and I think the American Rescue Plan and the two pieces of coming legislation on infrastructure and on supporting families are critical to that, and businesses can help support that along the way, along the process. And continuing to be understanding and modeling being understanding of one another. Dave said something which just struck me, because I think it's so true, which is how habits are difficult to break in any direction. And it's very easy for someone to say, hey, we just said no mask wearing, why are you wearing a mask? Just as it's easy to say, people are supposed to be wearing masks, why aren't you wearing a mask? And this whole notion of judging one another and side eye, et cetera. But for our society to build back better, I think it's really about us saying, we're going to go to our own, people are going to go at their own pace. This is not going to be dictated, driven by the government. Increasingly, the decisions on how fast we build back are going to be yours to make. Government will do its best to provide guidance and indeed regulate the things that are appropriate to be regulated, whether it's a state or other levels. But that's not going to be the norm as we move out of this pandemic. Keeping each other safe is all of our responsibility.
Yeah, I just add that I think this is well said. I think what happened and what continues to happen is bigger than it's bigger than any individual company. It's bigger than Amazon. It's bigger than any individual company. And I think all these companies are just big collections of people. And I think we've all faced this together. Whether it be citizens of the U.S. and we're all pulling whatever resources we have to help support each other through this. To being citizens of the world. I mean, even right now, India is struggling with an incredible challenge. And I know that the U.S. Chamber and all the businesses it represents, along with us, and lots of other companies are bringing everything they can to bear to support India, in what has been a devastating new surge of cases. And I think one of the things I'm hopeful for here, and maybe this sounds a little pie in the sky, but I'm hopeful that one of the things we all learned here, or we'll take away from this, is that really we are all connected globally, and not just in the U.S. but also globally, and that all these companies and big organizations and big groups of people can, when working together and challenged with big objectives, can come together and can figure things out, can solve these problems, and can sort of really deliver sort of some fundamental miracles, like vaccines and in record time, and the kinds of humanity that we've seen from people around the world, big and small, has been. I think there's some real gifts out of this that over the course of time maybe we can take and channel into a way to continue to figure out these public-private partnerships. How do we make them better? How do we make them bigger? How do we tackle the big challenges facing us, whether it be the pandemic or climate change? I think it's going to take a mix of these public-private partnerships and people at all levels working together to figure out how to solve these enormous challenges that are in front of us.
So Dave's mention of India brings me to a question for you, Andy. So we expect the U.S. to begin accumulating a significant number of excess doses of the vaccine, probably, or at least according to the estimates I've seen, starting in June. When do you expect the United States to be in a strong enough position to share some of its surplus vaccines with countries like India or other international partners, that are suffering, at this stage of the pandemic?
So unfortunately, this could be my last question. But I so appreciate the time, and I so appreciate each of you out there and what you've done. We have, as we get into better shape here, as more people get vaccinated here, and as soon as the FDA proves that we can begin moving doses overseas as we have already, 10% of the doses that we bought for ourselves are going to go overseas by the 4th of July. And we're going to be net exporters. We're building factories here, creating jobs here, exporting vaccines to the globe. And that's both an important humanitarian thing to do. It's a good business thing to do. It's a good public health thing to do. So with that, I'm going to unfortunately have to say I've got to run, but I so appreciated being with everybody today.
Well, thank you to Andy Slavitt and Dave Clark for joining us today. I'm going to throw out what I was going to say at the end of this, and I'm actually just going to quote something that Andy said earlier. We're all in this together. Let us know how we can help. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for all the work that all of the businesses have been doing to help vaccinate America. Have a good day. Be well.